One of my favourite kinds of horror is the folk subgenre. Between the combination of a slowly unfolding mystery, a remote setting, a fish out of water protagonist, secretive villagers, barbaric practices and supernatural entities, there's something about this style that really gets under my skin. It's a popular trope in movies, but plenty of games have also dealt in folksy scares. It's been particularly prominent in Asian titles, Fatal Frame being a prime example, but there have been some more Western inspired ones in the last few years like Mundown, Made of Scare, and the most recent Resident Evil installments. Be sure to check out my videos on how RE7 and RE8 use filmic influences. The newest addition to the folk horror canon is the Excavation of Hob's Barrow by developers Cloak and Dagger Games, which takes the form of a sprite-based point-and-click adventure and meets just about all of the criteria. This relatively low-resolution art style is more common in the horror genre than you might think, and can be just as creepy as the more graphically endowed releases. You can trace it back to Clock Tower in the 90s, and since then there's been The Witch's House, The Count Lucanor, Mr. Hop's Playhouse, Carrion, The Last Door, and Omori, to name but a few. Then there's the Dev Zone Pass projects like Football Game. Sometimes all it takes is some modest little pixels to paint a horrific picture. My first thought upon discovering the Excavation of Hob's Barrow was, what the hell is a barrow? Turns out it's a large mound of earth they used to cover graves with in ancient times. In the 18th and 19th centuries, digging these up to find anthropological remains and artefacts became something of a sport for the upper classes. My second thought was, point and click Victorian indie folk horror? Shut up and take my money. It tells the story of a young woman named Thomasina Bateman, a barrow digger who travels the country documenting her finds for a book she's writing. She's following in the footsteps of her father, also an antiquarian, who trained her in the practice from a young age, as revealed through flashbacks. He's now catatonic in a hospital bed, for reasons episodically explained by Thomasina in a letter to her mother, used as a framing device. In this sense, the entire game is a flashback. She gets a letter from one Leonard Shoulder asking her to investigate Hob's Barrow in the remote Yorkshire village of Bewley. When she arrives though, she finds many of the residents are wary of her and reluctant to share any information regarding her assignment. Some are downright hostile and condemn her efforts to explore the Barrow. Unable to find her contact, it's up to Thomasina to ingratiate herself with the locals and piece together the sinister history of the area.
Is there a single barrow in England that doesn't have some ghastly tale attached to it? Hogwash. All of it.
As well as being inspired by similar games, the story was originally going to be based on the works of H.P. Lovecraft, but the developers ultimately took influence from folk horror classics as well as old school BBC productions including The Stone Tape and The Ghost Stories of M.R. James. This seems fitting because Thomasina is reminiscent of a BBC drama heroine. She's a likeable protagonist, headstrong and inquisitive, but polite and charming with a wry sense of humour, even in the face of animosity from the people of Bewley.
Bugger off!
Ah, the unmistakable charm of old Cyril.
She stands out as an outsider through both her more well-spoken southerly accent and the fact she's the only woman who wears trousers. Not exactly ostentatious, but she's still designed in contrast to the more conservative villagers. This bonds the player with her, which is fortunate as, given the fact her assistant fails to arrive, it's just you and her at the mercy of the unwelcoming wilderness. The first thing you see after getting off the train en route into Bewley is nothing really. The moors stretch out into the distance, unfettered by landmarks. They encompass the plaintive isolated settlement and establish a thick premise of gothic horror, which continually builds until the story's denouement. The setting has all the makings of an Emily Bronte novel. Just looking at this vast moor makes me want to cry out for Heathcliff. The whole game has a somewhat muted palette, lending it an enduring sense of melancholy and mystery, from the wide grey-white sky to the yellow window lights cutting through the foggy evenings. While other sprite-based titles have gone for a more minimalistic aesthetic, the Excavation of Hob's Barrow has some strikingly detailed artwork that makes the sense of scope and perspective palpable even in 2D. The animation of these sprites is intricate, sometimes subtle but immersive. Everything from the billowing leaves to the distant grazing sheep help bring this otherwise austere world to life. I also love the way Thomasina appears to look at the camera incredulously during conversation, reminiscent of Oliver Hardy. The larger scale dramatic cutscenes are strikingly unsettling too. These have become something of a trademark for Cloak and Dagger, who purposefully created several of them, aiming to create an uncanny sense of otherness according to an interview with DreadXP. Their slow, jerky movements brought to mind those creepy stop-motion animations of yore, like Jason and the Argonauts, Return to Oz, and The Adventures of Mark Twain. Now, any horror worth its salt needs to effectively use sound, and Hob's Barrow doesn't disappoint. Here you might expect traditional folk instruments played in a sombre fashion, or maybe the common forlorn piano notes. And yes, there are some sublime strings, but the soundscape is often one of electronic ambience and industrial dissonance, an anachronistic choice against its olden days setting. Even the innocuous inn, the Plough and Furrow, has Silent Hill vibes in its background music, and the singer who shows up manages to be foreboding with just a single instrument, as does the feral fiddler, a curious musical child who Thomasina encounters out in the wild. Speaking of which, sometimes it's the quiet stillness that's used to great effect, priming you before punctuating the story with sudden twists of the macabre. A good example is the opening moments when Thomasina gets off the train at the station, her last safe connection to the outside world and where there's only the sound of rain. As soon as she leaves the station and steps into the barren wilds though, an ominous track kicks in, suggesting that although the locale looks unremarkable, there might be more going on than meets the eye. As is often the case with well-crafted horror, the silence can be deafening. It isn't just the sound and visuals that set the tone though. The villagers live up to the folk horror stereotype by being aloof, wary, and sometimes downright aggressive towards the stranger in their midst. They're a memorable bunch, and you may feel your allegiances change as the plot thickens. One of the first you'll encounter is Arthur Tillett, ostensibly a drunken sex pest, but one who later becomes something of a sympathetic ally. Similarly, your first encounter with Father Roach, the vicar, is less than pleasant, but he soon turns out to be an amiable assistant who intermittently quizzes you on Shakespeare. More enigmatic is the smarmy, debonair Lord Panswick, who seems to have some influence over Bewley, but meets his match when he tries to flirt with our heroine. They all make cryptic remarks, some of which have a grin-inducing impact when you hear them again after seeing the finale. The question though is whether the game merits another playthrough. As much as I felt sad when it was over, there are no changes other than bits of dialogue and achievements for different choices, which sadly makes it a bit of a one and done, when I could have seen myself more readily returning had there been different routes or endings. The gameplay tying all of these elements together is quite standard as far as my experience with the genre goes. The harrowing hamlet is broken into multiple sets and you move around by clicking where you want to go. Same goes for interacting with your surroundings. Talking to people will usually bring up a list of replies to choose from, and pressing them for info will give you clues as to what your next move should be. There are lots of useful collectibles too. You'll build up an inventory robust enough to keep the cogs in your brain turning for solutions, but not too many that it becomes overwhelming. For instance, a sugar cube from the pub can be used to calm a rowdy horse so that you can cut some of its tail hairs to mend a fiddle bow, which can be given to the feral fiddler to unlock the next key scene. It gets a bit fetch questy at times, especially the hoops you have to jump through to get some of Mrs. Duplancy's Bakewell puddings, but such is the nature of this genre. Most of the puzzles were satisfying and didn't take a tedious amount of time, which is something that can quickly make me lose interest. I don't mind a challenge, but I hate to feel stuck against my will, so Hob's Barrow never felt like too much of a slog. Anyway, never mind the overbearing isolation, the reserved inhabitants, the uncomfortable ebb and flow of the audio. The scariest thing about the Excavation of Hob's Barrow is that it's based on a true story. Well, not entirely, but it does take influence from real-world places, people and folklore. Hobhurst's house is an actual barrow in Beeley Moor, Derbyshire. The name's similar to those of the damnable in-game village in its barrow. Several of its areas are actually based on real landmarks surrounding Hobhurst's house, as documented by YouTuber and intrepid explorer Adventure Game Geek. The nearby Devonshire Arms pub looks just like the Plough and Furrow, while St Edmund's Church takes after the one in Castleton to the northwest. The chapel Lord Panswick is building, similarly, is modelled after the ruined St James's in Bix Bottom, South Oxfordshire, itself the filming location for the influential folk horror movie The Blood on Satan's Claw. Hobhurst's house was excavated in 1853 by one Thomas Bateman, a celebrated barrow digger dubbed the Barrow Knight and evidently Thomasina's namesake. He even shares a resemblance with her father, as far as you can tell from his portrait in this sprite artwork. Thomasina states that she's working on a book called Vestiges of the Antiquities in Rural England, which is taken from an actual publication by Thomas Bateman, although that one was specifically about Derbyshire. A fellow barrow enthusiast, Reverend Charles Wools, who had overseen a dig in Dorset in 1838, even wrote a play about it, including a song that parodied Shakespeare's Hamlet. This is the very song that Thomasina sings over a pint in the pub, and might even be the reason why the game's Reverend is obsessed with the bard.
Clasps, celts and arrowheads I'll try to claw within my clutch. And if a shield I should espy, I'll vow there ne'er was such.
The name Hob itself, meanwhile, comes from an elf said to inhabit the barrow, not unlike the phantasmagorical Saxnot who Thomasina meets in a dream. But I can't say much else about him. This is really the sort of experience you should go into knowing as little as possible. As I touched on at the beginning when discussing scary sprites, Cloak and Dagger's latest offering is by no means alone in its field, as much as its main character might be at times, but for such a relatively short adventure, it's certainly one that's stuck with me. Jump scares and monsters are 10 a penny in a sea of PT clones and zombie blasters, but if you want horror that's a bit more slow burning and insidious, I recommend you dig into Hob's Barrow.
Which work is that quote from?
Romeo and Juliet. Oh, he's gone.